We ask a lot from those who serve, but at times, American servicemen and women have been put in situations and environments that can put their health at risk. Exposure to toxic chemicals during service can follow a veteran for life. They recently passed Promise to Address Comprehensive Toxins Act, promises veterans treatment for exposure-related illnesses. Stay with us as we unpack the PACT Act. For decades, American servicemen and women have been exposed to toxic chemicals. Agent Orange was a powerful herbicide used by military forces to eliminate forest cover. Exposure to it causes a variety of health issues, including cancer. The practice of burning trash in massive burn pits has also exposed our servicemen and women to smoke and chemicals that can affect their health for the rest of their lives. The Promise to Address Comprehensive Toxins, or PACT Act, was designed to help those who suffered as a result of these types of exposures. The recent passing of the PACT Act has the potential to change the lives of many veterans for the better. Tonight, we will explain the elements of this law as we explore the PACT Act Unpacked. Thanks for tuning in to Veterans Voices. Tonight, we have a very special show. I'm sure you'll learn a lot. I'm your host, Nathan Johnson, and tonight we will be breaking down the PACT Act and answering any questions that you may have. If you want to be part of the conversation, call us at 925-313-1170. Send us a message through Facebook at Veterans Voices 1 or email us veteransvoices@ContraCostaTV.org. I want to introduce tonight's guest, a very special friend of mine, and I can't think of someone who knows more about the PACT Act than this gentleman. He's a veterans advocate and a VA accredited agent, Jim Radogna. Jim, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me, Nathan. Great to see you.
Good to see you too. And we've got a lot to cover in an hour. I know that our audience is very curious about how we can unpack the PACT Act for them. And we'll start tonight's first segment with a conversation more about the burn pits, those who served in the Middle East. And I know that at least in the 20 years that I've been helping veterans, I've been very aware of how Desert Storm veterans were exposed to burning oil wells, and Gulf War syndrome has significantly affected many of those veterans. And then as we went on, vets who served in Iraq and Afghanistan, we know they were exposed to toxic chemicals through burn pits, and even some of the yellow cake radiation waste from Al Tawitha nuclear test facility. But the PACT Act specifically has outlined a list of conditions that it presumes are related to military service. We're going to start with the burn pit, and then we'll get into the other segments about Agent Orange and then Camp Lejeune. So, Jim, let's help our audience. Let's walk them through by understanding, in terms of toxic exposure based on Middle East service, what does this mean in terms of where a veteran has served and whether or not they need to prove whether or not they were exposed to a specific toxic exposure?
So, great question, Nate. The burn pits or Gulf War service connections has really been challenging over the last 30 years because the VA has addressed really only a handful of conditions and made it very, very difficult for veterans to prove that there had conditions from toxic exposure. The VA has long realized that, these Gulf War veterans are coming back and having all kinds of medical issues, unexplained issues, but VA kind of, didn't say, well, we don't really know what it is, and they didn't really address them. With the PACT Act, they have addressed a number of over 20 cancers, respiratory conditions, a lot of conditions that they've kind of avoided in the past.
And a lot of these nasty cancers are things that our veterans don't want. Pancreatic cancer, kidney cancer, even brain cancer. How does the VA, what kind of research does the VA do to understand which conditions are presumptive for service connection? I know that with Vietnam veterans in Agent Orange, they studied the ranch hands and the Vietnam population and the Vietnam veteran population. But in anywhere in the PACT Act, Jim, did they give any kind of hints in terms of what has been used to determine what specific cancer conditions are related to the toxic exposure?
So I think the answer to that, Nate, is not yet. They've identified a number of cancers, different conditions, but right now this is kind of new. They put together this act with honestly kind of limited medical evidence at this point. They've done some limited studies over the last few years and said, okay, these young veterans coming back are, have all kinds of cancers, head cancers, neck cancers, respiratory cancers, genointuitory cancers. They've seen the whole gamut of it, but they haven't really done the extensive research yet that they've been able to do with the Vietnam veterans and so on that goes back 50 years and so. So at this point, they've identified a number of cancers that they've seen, but they've also left open in the bill that the Secretary of Veterans Affairs is now mandated to look in the future at possible other cancers, conditions, and so on. And they've put together some specific directives on how to move forward with this, and not just limited to the 20, just over 20 presumptive conditions now, but to continuously look at this and see, okay, there may be 20 more or 30 more or 50 more moving forward. So this is really exciting.
Yeah, in fact, one of the big things about this is that the Secretary now has the authority to add additional conditions, whereas in the past, it was the role of Congress to determine if a condition was presumptive for service connection based on toxic exposure like Agent Orange. And so there's many cancers, but there's also several conditions that are not cancer but are very specific to breathing conditions. It seems that chronic asthma, chronic bronchitis, chronic rhinitis, chronic sinusitis are some very common conditions for our young Iraq and Afghanistan veterans. I know I've seen a lot of these conditions come into our office, but there's some very unique conditions on here like COPD and sarcoidosis. Have you heard at all about how these more unique conditions are manifesting? And I know that for Vietnam veterans, a lot of the conditions don't manifest until they reach their 60s or 70s, but are we seeing a good number of younger veterans develop sarcoidosis or COPD in their younger age?
Absolutely. And you're absolutely right. The cancers, the diabetes, a lot of the long-range conditions took many, many years or decades to manifest in Vietnam veterans. But with the Gulf War exposures, they realized early on, 25 years of it, holy cow, these veterans are coming back and they have a lot of respiratory conditions, your asthmas, rhinitis, sinusitis, COPD. They had a lot of conditions all around, but those were preeminent. We just saw a lot of those, and those are the ones that tend to manifest pretty quickly. Your asthmas, your respiratory conditions, they'll manifest, in service or right after service, and not that what we've seen in the past about the Vietnam conditions and perhaps the radiation conditions that took years or decades to manifest. So we're seeing this. And what's interesting with asthma and three of the conditions, asthma, rhinitis, sinusitis, were actually, the VA Secretary McDonough made them presumptive about a year ago, before the PACT Act, back in August of 2021. And so some people are saying, okay, so now these are added back into the PACT Act, and why? So the difference is that when they added those a year ago, they said, well, we will service connect you for these if the condition became manifest within 10 years of your exit from service. What the PACT Act has done is said, yeah, we're adding these same things, but we're saying at any time, there's no time limit ever. If you get it 30 years from now, or 10 years ago, these are presumptive conditions. So they've kind of realized, they've opened that up and said, yeah, we're not going to limit it. We're not going to say it's 10 years or 5 years or whatever. If you get these respiratory conditions, we are going to concede that these were from your exposures in Southwest Asia. So
at any point in their
really
life.
Really good stuff.
I think that invites the opportunity for us to maybe clarify for our audience what exactly a presumption means. Because I know in my office, I get a lot of veterans even confused about the criteria the VA requires for service connection. And I think what's helpful is our audience know that the VA requires three things in order to establish service connection. They require evidence of an event, injury, or illness on active duty. They require evidence of a current chronic condition. And they require evidence of a nexus, which is generally a medical opinion linking the current condition to the military service. So the presumption, Jim, help our audience understand, what is this presumption exactly presuming?
Great question, Nate. The toughest part is the nexus. The event or illness, whatever, in service is usually documented. The current condition, that's usually pretty easy. Went to my doctor and I've got a diagnosis of COPD or diabetes, whatever the case may be. The most difficult part of veterans has been that nexus, that link between what happened in service and what you're experiencing now. So what the presumption does is it eliminates that need. So if you have, you don't even have to show that you had an event or anything in service. What
That's
the presumption
presumed as
says
well.
is, okay,
Yeah.
So if you were, let's say, for example, you were in Vietnam and you have diabetes mellitus, you don't have to any longer prove that you had something that happened in service that caused your diabetes now. If you were in Vietnam, the presumption is you were exposed to Agent Orange, and Agent Orange is, it's presumed that Agent Orange causes diabetes. So it eliminates that middle piece that you talked about, which is the toughest part. So presumptions makes it so much easier for veterans to prove, because they don't need medical evidence. They don't have to get outside doctor opinions. It's just, if you're in A and you have condition B, you are presumed, and we will service connect you for that.
Yeah, I think, veterans who come into our often, particularly Vietnam veterans, they often come in prepared with, how am I supposed to show that I was exposed to Agent Orange? And oftentimes the VA even sends them a letter saying, we need evidence from you that you were exposed to Agent Orange. And in the presumption, particularly with toxic exposure, burn pits, the VA is saying, we know the burn pits happened. We know that toxic exposure occurred as a result. We don't need to take any kind of test to show whether any of that toxic exposure entered into your body or not.
Right.
And we don't even need to get a doctor's opinion relating this condition to your military service. As you're saying, Jim, if you have a diagnosis of one of these chronic conditions, the VA will say, with the medical diagnosis, service connection is established. Now, the unique thing about this in regards to toxic exposure is the extensive list of where this toxic exposure occurred. And it seems like the VA maybe is learning some things about how the process of Agent Orange went about. Because originally, Agent Orange, and we'll get into this in the second segment in a little bit more detail, but originally Agent Orange was just specific to boots on the ground service in Vietnam. And now it's much more extensive. And with toxic exposure with burn pits, it ranges from service in Afghanistan and Iraq, of course, to service in Bahrain, Somalia, and UAE. So what are we hearing about that, Jim, in terms, it even includes the airspace above. So what are we hearing in terms of the VA's reasoning and how a veteran might go about proving their service in one of these specific, I almost say counties, countries?
So that's the great thing. One of the great things about the PACT Act, they don't have to prove it anymore. I mean, other than military records, generally proving that you were in a particular place during your services, it qualified usually pretty easy. It's usually in your service records. Back in the day, back in the Vietnam era or Korean era, it could have been a little more difficult because records were paper and they got lost. But nowadays, it's pretty easy to prove I was in Iraq, I was in Iran, I was in Afghanistan, and so forth. So that's kind of the easy part. What's nice about this is all you have to do is have some kind of military records showing that you were in, any number of countries during, it actually starts back in August of 1990. In many of the countries. Some of them actually started after 9/11, but it's from 1990 and into infinity, because it used to be, between 1990 and say 2016, 2018, they kept kicking the can down the road and saying, all right, we're going to extend it. The PACT Act extends that forever. There is no limit anymore. So 50 years from now, if you were in any of those countries and one of these diseases manifests, you will be eligible for service connection. So all you have to do is show through military records that you were there, even in the airspace above, which is great. That
right.
If you flew over.
Yeah, flight logs.
You are eligible.
Yeah,
it's really easy.
Right, flight logs oftentimes show the flight path of someone's originating flight and destination of the flight and such. Ship logs.
Absolutely.
I know that the Blue Water Navy Act changed what was the definition of a country, and it included its territorial waters. So I think that's a very good point, Jim. Your service records generally will reflect where you were. Flight logs, ship logs, TDY orders even.
Exactly.
And as you mentioned, August 2nd of 1990 for service in Bahrain, Iraq, Kuwait, Oman, Qatar, Saudi Arabia, Somalia, UAE, and then service after 9/11, Afghanistan, Djibouti, Egypt, Jordan, Lebanon, Syria, Uzbekistan, and Yemen. Any service, any one-day period of service in any of these countries presumes that exposure. I just want to acknowledge Dennis Miller, and he has mentioned he wants us to talk about the PACT Act in regards to Thailand service. And I think that's a perfect transition because we're going to cover Agent Orange, in particular Thailand service, in segment 2. So this will wrap up our first part of the conversation. So honored to have Jim on the show tonight. Again, a great friend and a real true expert in regards to the PACT Act. This man has stayed up late studying this act in fine print from front to back. When we come back, we will continue this very important conversation. Right now, we want to honor the life and service of Ben Griswold in this month's Shadowbox segment.
Tonight's very special virtual Shadowbox belongs to Corporal Ben Griswold of 1st Battalion, 6th Marines. During combat service in Iraq, he was exposed to radiation near the Al Tawitha Nuclear Research Facility. After his honorable discharge in 2006, he developed serious health complications as a result. He lost his valiant fight on January 29th, 2021. We honor his service and dedicate this show to his memory.
veterans are mission oriented. Now you need to be selfish. You need to take care of your future, and you need to be, for people that are volunteers, they know that they have to adhere to the mission and win. So you got to get forward and advocate for yourself. Get a battle buddy, whether it's your incredible spouse or a fellow veteran, and you need to be a victor. There's no room for waiting and watching. You gotta take that new mission and complete it.
So honored to have the opportunity to memorialize again Corporal Ben Griswold. We knew Ben very well in our office. He was a work study, and his exposure to yellow cake radiation residuals from his service in Iraq during the invasion and the Al Tawitha nuclear research facility, it was really remarkable at the time because we were just seeing some of the very first cases of how toxic exposure had led to some very significant illnesses. And today, you know, Ben would probably be in a much different situation with his disease being presumed by the VA as a result of the PACT Act. So I'm really glad that we had the opportunity to honor Ben, and we also honor his family tonight as they continue to live and live on his legacy here in Contra Costa County. So, continuing the conversation to segment number 2, again, I'm joined by my good friend and an expert, a veteran advocate, Jim Radogna, and we're talking about the Promise to Address Comprehensive or PACT Act. Do you want to be part of our conversation? Call us at 925-313-1170, or send us a message through Facebook at Veterans Voices 1, or email us, veteransvoices@contracostatv.org. And we've already had some comments and questions, which we'll address during segment 3. So we'd love to have your participation. I heard the phone ring even a few minutes ago as well. So we're going to shift, Jim, and to a topic probably much more widely known by the general population, and that's the topic of Agent Orange. And Agent Orange has been in law and presumptive since the 90s, but has significantly expanded. And over the past couple of years with the Blue Water Navy Act, which meant Agent Orange exposure included not only in-country service, but its territorial waters. But here we have the expansion of Agent Orange outside of Vietnam. It no longer really makes it a Vietnam issue. Can you help our audience understand a little bit about where now presumption of service connection includes other areas beyond Vietnam?
Absolutely. So there's Vietnam, which is, as Nate said, it's been considered the boots on the ground. You've actually been in country in South Vietnam, which is the Republic of Vietnam, or more recently, as of 2020, in the territorial waters of Vietnam. You were presumed to be exposed to Agent Orange. But I like to think of the Vietnam era. And the Vietnam era encompassed so much more than that. There was countries such as Thailand, which is right next to Vietnam, Cambodia, Laos, Guam. There was a tremendous amount of support for the Vietnam War in Guam. There was massive air bases. You know, the planes would be coming from there and so on. And these Vietnam era veterans were also exposed to toxins. Congress long ago back in the 90s conceded that if you were in the Republic of Vietnam, you were exposed to Agent Orange and herbicides, Agent Orange, Agent Blue, and so forth. But what they did not acknowledge is that all of these Vietnam era veterans in these countries around Vietnam that supported the war, they're also spraying these herbicides on the bases there and so forth. So it's been really a challenge for veterans in Thailand, Guam, Cambodia, Laos, Johnson Atoll, and so forth to they've been suffering with the same cancers and diabetes and diseases that the acknowledged Vietnam boots on the ground veterans have. So it's really been a struggle for decades for them to get compensation for their conditions. With the PACT Act, it's amazing because they finally acknowledged that if you were stationed in Thailand, which again is right next to Vietnam, it's right there. If you were stationed in Guam, if you were stationed in Cambodia, which is also right next to Vietnam, Laos, all these other countries, you are also eligible for VA to concede that you were exposed to herbicides. Agent Orange is kind of that's the most famous one, but there's other herbicides, Agent Blue, White, so on and so forth. And then, that being the case, any condition that is on the presumptive list for Agent Orange exposure, these veterans are now eligible for not only compensation benefits, but health care. And they've also added 2 new conditions to the Agent Orange presumptive list, which is hypertension and another condition called it's monoclonal gammopathy of undetermined significance, otherwise known
That's
as
a mouthful.
NGUS, or I guess whatever they call it. So they've added that. So they've really vastly expanded exposure to herbicides around the world rather than just Vietnam.
The Thailand service was previously included for Agent Orange presumptive conditions, but it was specific to just the base perimeters. Korea, or service along the DMZ in Korea, still is just inclusive or exclusive to just DMZ service. But what's interesting here is that service in Guam is actually extended well beyond the period of the Vietnam War. Service in Guam starts in 1962, which is where I believe service in Vietnam begins, but is extended through July 30th of 1980. And I can only assume that this must involve, I guess, the assumption or the presumption that maybe Agent Orange or these other toxic chemicals were actually stored there and not actually used. But this does extend anyone who served on the base of Guam or in the Navy that served in the Guamanian territorial waters or made a port of call there to now have been presumed exposed to Agent Orange. This includes thousands of other veterans that have never been covered under Agent Orange exposure.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah, it extends 5 years beyond the official end of the Vietnam War in 1975. And it's a great point you bring up. It's because what they were doing in Vietnam, it's well known that they sprayed Agent Orange from planes. They sprayed it over the country because they wanted to defoliate, and so that for security purposes, they wanted to make sure that the enemy couldn't hide behind this really thick tropical foliage. But in places like Guam and Thailand, they didn't do that because they weren't fighting a war there. Again, this was support. But they sprayed these same defoliants in those countries because they were, again, these are tropical countries. It's, massive foliage. So they sprayed this around the bases and just for security purposes to make sure that these bases weren't being attacked. In Thailand, there was a lot of insurgent attacks. So they wanted to make sure, okay, we want to be able to see the enemy so we can resist them and so forth. So VA never, it's been well known, but they've never really acknowledged that before. In Thailand, for example, back in 2010, some reports became declassified, and they kind of found out that, oh yeah, we were spraying the perimeters of our bases there. So VA said, well, yeah, if you were on the perimeter, you were right there kind of touching the fence around the end of the base, we will acknowledge. But quite honestly, these defoliants were, covered the whole bases and so forth. So with the PACT Act, they finally acknowledged that, you know what, these defoliants, herbicides, whatever you want to call it, Agent R, was sprayed all over the world during the Vietnam era. And no matter if it was sprayed around the perimeter or sprayed, here, it affected all, the air drift and so on and so forth. So basically, if you were in Thailand on any base, if you were in Guam on any base, as you mentioned, if you were in the waters around Guam, if you were in Cambodia, Laos, so on, we're not going to, nitpick anymore and say you had to be, within 500 feet of the fence. We're saying if you were there, we're going to cover you. And it's going to cover, as you said, thousands more veterans.
Now, I think what's important for our audience to understand, and I know we somewhat covered this in the first segment, but I do want to emphasize that Agent Orange exposure alone is not a contention for service connection. Although the exposure did occur, and the VA will concede that based on service in these countries during these time periods, without developing one of the chronic conditions, the VA will not grant service connection. And hypertension is such an important addition to the Agent Orange list because it ties into a whole array, and I wish either one of us were doctors and we could expand on that a little bit. But my layman knowledge says that hypertension exists pretty commonly amongst the population and can lead to other pretty significant debilitating conditions like stroke. I know that we have
heart disease. Yeah.
Oh, go ahead, Jim. Sorry.
Yeah, heart disease.
Yes.
Yes, absolutely.
Right.
Many sectors.
Yeah, we have questions that are coming in, and we'll get to these questions in this third segment in regards to, is the VA going to be able to handle, all of the compensation claims that are coming in? And I know that in our office, we are seeing a significant increase in the number of veterans applying for service connection based on Agent Orange exposure with the addition of hypertension. Bladder cancer, Parkinson-like syndrome were added recently as well. I think something that's unique to the PACT Act here, Jim, that was very clearly specified, and our audience may not have a lot of familiarity with this, but those that are involved in this industry, Niemer, the court case that said the VA could go back to the original diagnosis if a claim was filed or to a previously denied claim for one of these presumptive conditions. Niemer doesn't apply in the case of veterans under the PACT Act. Do you want to expand on that a little bit and maybe emphasize a little bit where it does apply in terms of survivors' benefits?
Yeah, and great point, Nate. And unfortunately, it doesn't. Niemer was a wonderful, it was a court settlement from many years ago. And Congress specifically wrote Niemer out of this law. And for two reasons. The Niemer, not only, it's very costly because any veteran that had a claim, could have been 20 years ago, 30 years ago, whatever, they could have been paid retroactive benefits based upon the Niemer settlement, even if it took them 30 years to get service connected. So there's a cost element there, in which Congress obviously was looking at. And the second thing was that it's kind of a burden, or at least the VA has claimed it to be a burden to them in terms of resources and timing, because what Niemer requires is that every single veteran or survivor or spouse, widow, that was ever had a claim, however long back, VA had to proactively go out, find all of these claimants and re-adjudicate their claims. And that takes a tremendous amount of resources and time. So VA kind of lobbied, back in March, they kind of lobbied Congress, said, hey, if you want us to do NEMR again, that's fine. However, understand that we will be backed up, for 1,000 years, and it's going to increase the cost of this bill dramatically. So I think, and this is just my opinion, I think that they were able to convince enough people in Congress to say, okay, well, we're not going to include that in this bill. So what that means in a nutshell is that if veterans that are awarded service connection for the PACT Act will not get, years or decades of retroactive benefits like they would have in the past. However, what Congress did do is they included an exemption for survivors. So if a widower applies for survivor benefits and they had applied years ago and were denied, under this act, they will be entitled to retroactive benefits in unlimited, could be 5 years, 10 years, 20 years, whatever the case may be. So that's a good thing. They're taking care of survivors, which is great. As far as veterans themselves, they're not entitled to retroactive benefits. There are some exceptions to that, which Nate may ask me about in a minute, but yeah, so it's a little different. So Blue Water Navy, real quickly, the Blue Water Navy Act a few years ago did include retroactive benefits for all veterans and survivors going back. The PACT Act does not. So
with the addition of hypertension and the additional areas, it doesn't. But for the previous presumptive claims, more recently, bladder cancer,
right.
Parkinson-like syndrome, et cetera. I want to add real quickly to what you're saying, Jim, and then we're going to conclude this segment. Just so surviving spouses know, in terms of service-connected cause of death, what the VA will consider is that either one of these conditions was the cause of death or was a contributory factor to death. And that's very important, I think, to distinguish, because if a veteran doesn't die from an Agent Orange condition, like diabetes, or like ischemic heart disease, but the condition itself led to the inability for the body to fight off the disease that eventually led to death, then contributory cause of death would establish a service-connected cause of death claim for benefits like dependency indemnity compensation. And where that's
Absolutely.
primarily articulated is on the death certificate, but doctors can also write statements that will clarify to the VA whether a presumptive condition contributed to the cause of death or was the primary cause of death as well. Jim, we're going to wrap up this segment, but we're going to come back to segment 3. We've got lots of people watching and asking questions tonight. So we hope to address your comments and your questions, your thoughts on the PACT Act when we return. Right now, we'll conclude our conversation and we'll come right back. We have another video for you. Enjoy.
When I served, my work was critical, and I don't feel like that's the case anymore.
I lost all of my friends when I got out. Had to start my whole life over.
I didn't know what to do each day. Then my marriage hit a real rough patch.
It got so bad that I was even thinking about suicide. I called the Veterans Crisis Line. I tell my buddies to call in case they ever need it.
When I retired, things slowed way down and lots of bad memories came back. I still go through tough times, but I'm glad I called.
You are not alone.
You are not alone.
You are not alone.
The person on the other end of the line isn't going to judge. Lots of responders are veterans too.
We all need to take care of ourselves. If you're going through a rough time, call the Veterans Crisis Line.
All right, we're back, and we're talking about unpacking the PACT Act tonight. And again, we have very good friend and expert on the PACT Act, Jim Radogna, joining me tonight. We want to welcome you to contact us with questions or comments. Our third segment is reserved for this, and I've got some folks already asking questions that we'll get to. But if you've got a question or comment, call us at 925-313-1170. Send us a message through Facebook Live, at Veterans Voices 1, or email us veteransvoices@ContraCostaTV.org. Jim, kind of getting through the questions here that are in the chat. One question pertains to, I think, whether the VA has the capacity. This question is, this comment, I know of numerous veterans that have been waiting months for a decision on their compensation claim. Will this new legislation have an impact on the time frame for decisions on older claims as well as current claims moving forward? I've got some thoughts on that, Jim, but I'll give you a first stab at it.
Unfortunately, yeah, I believe it will. This again this is a massive bill, and VA. I was reading recently that August 10th, 2022 was when the bill was signed into law. August 11th, VA broke a record of the number of claims that were filed that particular day, and I think it's been kind of going up from there. So there is, the volume is tremendous, and also VA in the PACT Act. The PACT Act was, extremely comprehensive. Congress did a great job of really kind of looking at all the aspects of this. So they added a whole lot of money for VA to hire new people, open new VA healthcare facilities, train people. They really thought, they kind of plugged all the holes and said, yeah, this is overwhelming. And VA is, as we all kind of know, they've been struggling for many years with their wait times and so on. So Congress anticipated that, but the reality on the ground is that they have to hire a whole lot of new people, and they have to train them. And training, this is very complicated, especially on the compensation side. Adjudicating these claims, medical opinion, so on. It's not, you can't just, I was speaking to recently the former Undersecretary of Benefits, Tom Murphy, and he's saying, he goes, yeah, it would be great if we could hire somebody on Friday and have them hit the ground running on Monday and start working claims. He goes, but honestly, it takes months or years. It takes a long time. So realistically, yeah, it's going to slow down things a lot. I know VA is, they've shared with us that they've got some new automated processes and artificial intelligence, and they're really trying hard to move these things forward. But I think, being quite honest, veterans and claimants can expect that things are going to slow down considerably.
Yeah, I would like to add to that. I consider our office to be a partner of the VA. But some of the efforts that have sped the VA's claim process up, like the National Work Queue, has somewhat been unraveled by things like the Blue Water Act, where claims for blue water and considerations for NEMR were actually being processed very specifically at designated regional offices. For example, Oakland Regional Office. And the length of claim for a blue water Navy, or for some of the additional presumptive conditions like hypothyroidism, which I've failed to mention, those claims have been taken on average a year. So I think it is fair to our audience to tell you to expect that the VA's wait time for compensation claims as a result of this is likely going to be extended. It is one of the easiest claims in my observation for a presumption of service connection, because once you review service records and determine that the person served in one of the areas in which presumption of exposure is conceded, then you just need to schedule a C&P exam to confirm that a chronic condition exists and the severity of that condition so that you can rate it appropriately. For example, cancer. If a veteran has cancer related to Agent Orange or to toxic exposure, the VA is going to rate that condition 100% during the time in which that cancer is active. So it is a very, relative to other types of more complicated claims like post-traumatic stress or sexual trauma, it is a very easy claim for the VA to process, but they are taking longer to make their way through the system. Another question here from Kathy, and this opens up another piece of the PACT Act, which if we can address real quickly, Jim, who do I contact to make a claim for someone that was stationed at Camp Lejeune? We're talking about contaminated water, and the Camp Lejeune Act was included in the PACT Act. We've got other questions flowing in, so I want to get to other questions, but thank you, Kathy, for your question. Jim, any reflections on the ability to now sue the federal government in regards to toxic water exposure?
Yeah, and that's a great question. So since March of 2017, veterans have been able to put in claims for certain conditions due to toxic water at Camp Lejeune, veterans and survivors. Now, with the PACT Act, it also includes virtually anyone that was associated with Camp Lejeune for 30 days or more during, I think, 1953 to 1987. So it could have been family members, civilian employees, and you're now actually able to sue the federal government for compensation beyond veterans benefits. So there's a lot of moving pieces, which we don't have time to get into, but yes, if you were, at Camp Lejeune or worked at Camp Lejeune or, not just a veteran, but a spouse, a child, and so on, you are now eligible potentially for benefits from illnesses from Camp Lejeune water.
So if someone has, and it's a much more limited list of diseases that are presumed based on the Camp Lejeune exposure, if someone wanted to pursue a lawsuit, they should pursue that through a trusted law firm who has hopefully expertise. If someone wanted to pursue VA benefits, such as disability compensation, VA healthcare, my recommendation to answer Kathy's question and to add to your answer, Jim, would be that a veteran continue to contact the County Veteran Service Office, and at the end of the show, we'll have resources in terms of phone numbers and websites where someone can find their local County Veteran Service Office. So thank you so much, Kathy, for that question. Moving on, Jeff in Martinez, if I have been diagnosed with a cancer, where do I go to find out if it is presumptive with the VA? Jim, what have you found is one of the best resources in which the VA lists what presumptive conditions are related to toxic exposure, Agent Orange, or burn pits?
Actually, the VA website, va.gov, is, they've got, just go into va.gov and put in the search box PACT, P-A-C-T, and they've done a really good job of outreach. The web page it's very clear. It lists all of the different presumptives, tells you, time period where you need to be and so forth. That to me is the simplest, best resource to kind of get an idea, say, okay, yeah, I checked those boxes and so on. For more specific information and filing and so on, absolutely reach out to a County Veteran Service officer, because they can walk you through all of that. But just to kind of, that basic information, I recommend getting on the va.gov.
Yeah, I add to that. And the one thing I've found to be very careful about is the PACT Act includes a list of conditions, but those lists of conditions only add to what the previous presumptions were, specifically for Persian Gulf veterans, such as fibromyalgia, irritable bowel syndrome, chronic fatigue. So look at the list of conditions that the VA has for the PACT Act, but add that to what already previously existed. Look at hypertension, but add that to some of the most common Agent Orange cancers are prostate cancer, non-Hodgkin's lymphoma, Those conditions have been around for many decades, or many years, I should say, as a result of the Agent Orange Act. So Jeff, the last thing I think I'd add to that is our office, the Contra Costa County Veterans Service Office, does keep a pretty comprehensive list of fact sheets. So if you visit the Contra Costa County Veterans Service Office website, under the benefit fact sheets, we'll have the list of all of the presumptive conditions based on Agent Orange exposure, based on Camp Lejeune contaminated water exposure, and based on burn pit exposure as well. In fact, I was using some of those fact sheets myself to reference during the show. So thanks very much, Jeff, for your question. We have a few more minutes here. We'll take other questions. Robert in Vallejo. My understanding is that a lot of people, veterans and non-veterans, have high blood pressure. The PACT Act states that a new Agent Orange presumptive condition is high blood pressure, hypertension. Will claims for VA coverage overwhelm the system? So I guess this is a question just similar to what we've got before. Will this overwhelm the VA? I think yes. As we've covered, hypertension in particular, not only as a condition itself, but the subsequent disabilities that might develop from hypertension, such as stroke, are going to lead to a lot of not only additional compensation claims, but need for VA healthcare. Jim, do you want to add anything else at all to the question or to the comment from Robert in Vallejo?
Yeah, so Robert, that's a good question, because hypertension, hypertension claims absolutely have the potential to overwhelm the system because there's so many of them. There's so many of us. I'll admit I have hypertension. Many Americans do, many veterans do. However, I think that the good news is that VA announced probably 6 months or so back that they were adding this automated artificial intelligence system. And the very first condition that they're working this new high-tech system is with hypertension claims. So, and I think that's why, initially when the PACT Act law actually said that hypertension wasn't going to become effective until, believe it or not, October 1st of 2026. But they've since adjusted that, and the VA secretary and the president they said, no, we're going to do this right now. Put your claims in now. We're going to start adjudicating these pretty soon. And the reason, from my interactions with VA leadership, was the reason why they wanted to do that was that, not only, let's take care of veterans and not wait, which is great, but, hey, we don't need to wait on hypertension. We certainly don't need to wait 4 years, because we've already had this on our radar. We've already put together the technology to work these claims as the very first in our new automated system. So, Robert, I'm hoping that based upon that they're going to be able to go through these, quicker than we think. There's a lot of them. There absolutely is a lot of them. But if the automated system works, then hopefully it won't be as bad as we think.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right, Jim. And if I could add to what you're saying too, thinking and reflecting on the work that we do through our office every day to help veterans, one of the most critical things that a veteran can do to ensure they don't add to the workload of the VA, I think, is to work with an accredited representative, whether it be through a county veteran service office, through a veteran service organization, or an accredited agent like Jim. Trying to go about the process on your own can lead to denials, and denials lead to appeals, and it adds to the workload, and it adds to the confusion and the frustration, not only for the VA, but certainly for the veteran. So I highly recommend, if a veteran out there is worried about, well, if I claim this benefit, I'll take it away from another veteran. If you work with a county veteran service officer or an accredited representative, you're only going to add to the ability of the VA to provide benefits. Having worked for the VA and in collaboration with the VA since 2003, I've only seen the VA system grow. Programs like vet centers, clinics, regional office locations. The Oakland regional office is not just Oakland any longer. I'm pointing in that direction because that's Oakland for me. It's now in Sacramento, it's now in Fresno. So I don't want to discourage veterans from not applying for these benefits out of any kind of fear or concern. that they are going to take away a benefit from another veteran or clog up the system. Work with an expert who will guide you and ensure that your claim being presented to the VA is presented with all the evidence to support it, and that it'll be successful. And that way we can work together to minimize any additional workload that the VA has. We have just a few minutes left. Jim, any final thoughts in regards to the PACT Act? I know we really didn't get into the healthcare. We didn't get a doctor here tonight, but anything else our audience should know, or anything we can encourage them to do from this point forward to ensure that if they're eligible, they take advantage of the benefits brought by this act?
Absolutely. So this is a great, we're so happy, and honestly, I was skeptical that this was going to pass because it's such a huge, massive bill. It was overwhelming. It cost a lot of money, but kudos to Congress, in the House and the Senate. They stepped up and they made this happen. One thing to keep in mind, and this is really important, if you've had a claim that was pending, let's say you were a Thailand veteran, a Guam veteran, Gulf War veteran, and you had a claim that you've been fighting for the last 2, 5, 10 years, and still in appeal status and so on, there's a potential in that case for you to get, once you get approved, granted, you can get substantial retroactive benefits back pay, back to your original claim. Although, as I mentioned before, the PACT Act does not have provisions for retroactive pay. If your claim has been pending and you've kept it alive, you may be the exception. You may be, even though if you're not a DIC recipient, a widow, if you're a veteran, in that case, it's a little bit tricky. It's a little complicated. I encourage you at that point, if get with your local CVSO.
Yes, absolutely.
If you're not already, because they can kind of guide you through that.
Absolutely.
Because what VA is probably going to say is, hey, we're not going to give you the retroactive, but that doesn't mean you don't deserve it. A CVSO can help you.
Absolutely. I hope our audience is tuned in and enjoyed this show. Jim, thank you so much. This concludes our discussion, but for those suffering from exposure-related illnesses, it is a new beginning. Here are some resources to help you find out if the PACT Act can help you.
We hope you've enjoyed our discussion about the PACT Act this evening. If you want to explore how the PACT Act may affect you, a County Veterans Service Officer is a good place to start. To find a county veteran service officer near you, in California, go to cacvso.org or call 844-SERVE-VET. Or find one anywhere in the country by visiting nacvso.org. Veterans Voices is brought to you in part by contributions from the Diablo Valley Veterans Foundation, dedicated to helping veterans near you. American Legion Post 246, honoring the tradition of the American Legion in Danville. If you would like to help sponsor Veterans Voices, you can donate to Veterans Voices, care of Diablo Valley Veterans Foundation. Get in touch with them at diabloveterans.org. To rewatch tonight's episode, check back on our homepage later this week, or check your cable provider's schedule for rebroadcast times. You can also rewatch this episode and many others on our YouTube channel, Veterans Voices of Contra Costa, so be sure to subscribe. Our next show will air on Monday, October 10th at 7 p.m. We will be talking with chaplains. You won't want to miss it. To all of our veterans and their families, thank you for serving. To all of you who tuned in tonight, thanks for watching and have a great evening.